Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Health Bridge podcast. I'm your host, Holly B. Today, I am speaking with Jared St. Clair, who is an herbalist and an expert natural supplement formulator with over 30 years of hands on experience running Vitality Nutrition, which is a well known health store in Utah. He's known for his Vital 5 essential supplements and has crafted highly effective formulas and protocols for health concerns from digestive issues and hormone imbalances to immune support and emotional wellness. As the host of the Vitality Radio podcast, Jared educates listeners on mastering natural supplements in order to thrive without pharmaceuticals, making him a leading voice in holistic health. I have been looking for someone qualified to have this conversation with. And what is that topic? Well, today we are actually going to dive into the subject of vaccines. Now, I believe that we have this discussion in a way that is very non judgmental, very non name calling. We really just want to get into the nuances of this conversation. And I just ask that you are open minded to it, no matter what side you are on. I think that is so much more than a black and white conversation of vax versus unvax. It's a very in depth subject with many different layers. And so I invite you into this conversation to see if there's something we talk about that maybe you didn't know prior, or to open your mind to some questions that you hadn't even thought to think of or thought to ask. I think that's a big problem around this vaccine debate is that we often don't know what we don't know when it comes to subjects like these. And it can be hard to figure out how to even dive in. And that means that sometimes it's easier to just go with the status quo. But again, this conversation is just inviting you to be willing to ask the questions and be open minded enough to have the conversations simply so that you are more informed the next time you are personally up against a decision involving should I or shouldn't I take this recommended medication. So there's so much more that we were planning on talking about in this episode, and we definitely did not get to the majority of it. So we will continue that likely in a part 2 episode, but there's so much good information in this episode. Please listen to this with an open mind. Again, no matter what side of the platform you're on, I know that you will learn something, if not many things. And with that, let's just dive in head first. Jared St. Clair, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to really dive deep with you today in this conversation.
I'm excited to be here. I'm always honored when anybody wants my voice on their show. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Definitely. We're just going to get right into it. This conversation might trigger some people because there are some potentially controversial opinions or thoughts around these topics. We're basically going to be talking about some of the big lies around pharma and how we can better inform ourselves so that we can make better decisions when we're put up against these things. And as everybody listening is aware, we've had quite a whirlwind over the last 5 years or so, tying all this health stuff into all this political stuff. And, I don't know if my platform is big enough to get canceled or flagged over this conversation, but we're just going to dive in and find out. So
I guess we will.
So I want to just start by talking about the truth around vaccine safety studies. And we can overlay, over that conversation, current politics, current events around COVID, around vaccines. I'm not scared to use that word vaccines like we were over the last few years. People were getting canceled just by saying the word. I think we're over that part of it now and we can actually start having conversations. So I would love to start with kind of what your experience was over the last several years, being that you are in a position where you are helping clients every single day deal with health issues and making recommendations for them. What the heck have you seen going on the last few years?
Well, it's an interesting thing. Off air before we hit record, we talked a little bit about COVID being this, it's such a monumental event that impacted everybody on some level, and in many cases in very, dramatic ways. Everything from businesses closing to vaccine mandates to illness and death, and everything around it was just crazy. And now we look back on it 5 years later, and it almost seems like it didn't happen, like it was some sort of a science fiction thing or something, right? But what I think did happen, and I'm grateful for, I always look at life in, I'm very much a half full kind of a guy when looking at the cup. And I think there is a silver lining to COVID. It was a nasty thing for everybody. Nobody escaped it unscathed and on some level, but it did create a lot of questions that weren't being asked before. I think a lot of people's eyes were open to maybe some uncomfortable truths that came out about it. And I'm glad for that, because as you said, we can say things and talk about things now that maybe, I guess we could talk about, but we'd either get deplatformed or, something else if we did. So the big thing right now is this announcement that RFK Jr. made just a few days ago. I'm not sure exactly when this show is airing, but as we're recording it anyway, it's just in the last week, that he said he's going to have an answer for, where autism comes from in September. Now, I don't know if he will or he won't, and I don't know what that answer might look like, but everybody is aware that RFK Jr. To at least some degree is a vaccine skeptic, we'll say, or has questions that people need to ask. And I think that one of the biggest problems with some of the division that we have in this country right now and in this world is that we have these terms that get thrown around that are meant to discredit people. We have terms like conspiracy theorist and anti-vaxxer and things like that. And you lump somebody into that category, and the idea is, well, they can't be trusted because they're crazy, because they believe in conspiracy theories or vaccines. Now, I think if you had your eyes open even a little bit during COVID, you recognize that a lot of what was being said wasn't really true about, everything from the origin story to the treatment of COVID and the things that did work and didn't work and all this other stuff. And so I do believe now a lot of people feel a little more validated that we're lumped in to those groups probably than they would have prior to COVID. And a lot of other people are asking questions. I've certainly had a lot of people asking me questions that I never heard, or at least rarely heard, prior to. So the big question, I think, in a lot of people's minds, whether you are someone who is strongly on the side of the childhood vaccination schedule in America, or someone who is opposed to it, or at least has questions about it, is, will RFK Jr. and his team say autism has something to do with vaccines? I have no idea what he's going to say. I don't know what's going to come of it. I have a lot of my own personal beliefs. I think what we need to do at this point, Holly, is we need to all be willing to just ask the questions. Because if we aren't willing to ask the questions, whether it's vaccines or Red 40 or heavy metal toxicity or excessive antibiotics that are messing with the microbiome or any number of things, how are we ever going to find the answers? You can't find answers without asking questions. And I think it's silly to immediately rule anything out as a possibility because, I don't remember who originally coined the phrase, but the truth is like a lion. If you release it, it'll defend itself, right? So when we start to dig into these questions, if what you believe is true, we're going to find out that it's true. And if what we believe is true is false, we'll probably be able to shoot some holes in what we, used to think was true. And when we're talking about autism, there's this big division too, and I don't want to go too far down the road of autism, but I'm seeing it constantly on social media. You have people with severely autistic children who, can't go to the bathroom by themselves, who tear holes in walls and rip doors off door frames. I have friends who have children like this. And I'm very close to the situation, maybe as close as I could be without actually having an autistic child myself, just based on some of my relationships. And then you have people who have very mildly autistic children, and of course, everything in between. And, we see things saying, well, wait, autism's not bad. It's just neurodivergence. These kids are fine. They can be happy and healthy and live a good life. And in the case of certain autistic kids, that is absolutely true. And in the case of other autistic kids, that is absolutely false. And so why we have to always come with this division of it's us against them and me against you and you're right and I'm wrong is it's so incredibly, it undermines the scientific process. It undermines our ability as a culture to try and figure out what actually is true. And I think it takes away a lot of the empathy that we ought to be having for one another, because whatever neurodivergence is, it's a spectrum, just like, the autistic spectrum. And there is no one autistic kid that's just like the other, just like every other kid that doesn't have autism is not like autism that is not like the other, right? So I think we need to at first start there and recognize that we're all not dealing with the same thing. These kids are not dealing with the same thing. But if it is an environmental exposure, like RFK is saying that it is, then shouldn't we know what that environmental exposure is, or what combination of environmental exposures there are that might be leading to this problem?
I totally agree with you. The division that I'm seeing around this topic on social media right now is out of control. I
Yeah.
see posts that are saying, basically shaming anybody for believing that this topic is about, how do I want to say this? I think that a lot of the division is coming from people who think that we are saying that people with autism are less than, they can't be functional in society, or that it's coming from a judgment standpoint. And that to me is a totally separate topic from what I believe personally that RFK is trying to get at with this. If we look at the numbers of autism rates, they have absolutely skyrocketed. And now I think the last time I heard a statistic on this, it was like 1 in 22 or 1 in 32 kids, something in that range.
The most recent one I've read is 1 in 31, 1 in 22 if it's boys, because it's
Okay.
more common in boys than girls. And the thing is, again, and I don't know, maybe we need to rethink the whole spectrum thing. And maybe we ought to have different categories that are much more clear, and it's not all just autism, right? But the last I read is that about 50% of autistic kids are either cannot speak or nonverbal, or are largely nonverbal, and the other 50% are not. 25% are basically incapable of living life without assistance, all day long, similar to a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or whatever else. And in some cases, even worse. And I know some of these kids and some of their parents, and it's an incredible tragedy. If autism is normal and natural, which I absolutely do not believe that it is, and that's my opinion, you can have yours, then fine, let's find out that it's normal and natural. Let's actually figure that out, and let's have that answer. If it is not, then we absolutely need to figure out how to stop it from happening the way that it is, because it does ruin lives, some, not all, and it does create massive problems for society and for families. I read a statistic the other day that 80% of parents of autistic children end up divorced. That's an incredible statistic right there. And then if you figure that a lot of these kids that are, on the low end of the spectrum, if you want to put it that way, are, seem to be doing largely fine, then on the other end of the spectrum, that number is probably much higher than 80%, right? Depending on where the kid's at and how much of a challenge. We also know that there are many families, and I know just off the top of my head, I can think of 3 or 4 families who are close to me that have multiple kids on the spectrum, which exacerbates everything, that much more. But as far as vaccines go, there are simple questions that I think need to be asked that I've been asking for a long time, but that aren't getting asked in mainstream media. They're not getting asked by government. That aren't being asked by pharma. So I like to start with the things that we know, because otherwise it is just a theory. And whether you want to call it a conspiracy theory or any other kind of theory, it's not science. It's the theory that we hope science bears out, one answer or another. So the vaccine safety what I think the big lie about vaccines is that they are strongly safety tested. And the second thing that I think is really important to understand is that doctors understand vaccines well. Doctors are not trained on vaccines other than the schedule in medical school. They aren't given safety data. They're not given strong training on how vaccines actually work. They know what the purpose of the vaccine is, but the actual mechanism of action, unless they decide to look at it themselves outside of medical school, that is not taught to them. And the same can be said about the nurses who are, largely the ones that are actually injecting these vaccines. So the safety data is very interesting. The most well-studied vaccine that I'm aware of is the rotavirus vaccine put out by Merck. And it's one of the very few vaccines that actually has what's called a true saline placebo. That's the equivalent of a sugar pill when it comes to a vaccine or to anything that would be injected. Just salt water. They inject salt water. We know salt water doesn't have side effects. And so it's an inert placebo that we can actually study, against something else. And it was a pretty large scale study also. It was double blind, placebo controlled. This is considered the gold standard of modern medicine. And it included 70,000 infants, with about 35,000 of those receiving saline versus the rotavirus vaccine. It is considered the gold standard of the type of studies and the gold standard of vaccine studies. However, the hepatitis B vaccine, which is typically given on the day of birth or the day after birth in America, and only in America that I'm aware of that it's given at that age, they were given not a saline placebo, but a placebo that specifically added aluminum as an adjuvant at the same level as was in the hepatitis B vaccine. Now, the majority of people that have questions about vaccines are not so concerned about the active ingredient in the vaccine, the actual virus, or, the pathogen, we'll say, is probably the right word, but concerned about the other ingredients in the vaccine. And the biggest concern has always been heavy metals. Aluminum is most commonly found in vaccines. Mercury used to be found a lot more, is found less now, but is still contained in some vaccines. So if you're trying to actually get a placebo to give zero ill effect and then compare it to a vaccine, the placebo can't have the same adjuvant aluminum as the vaccine does. And in the case of the hepatitis B vaccine, that is not what happened. They actually used aluminum in both, meaning that the side effect profile should probably end up looking relatively similar, which means it's not placebo-controlled study at all. No group in those studies received any inert substances at all. The DTaP vaccine was compared not against saline, but against other DTaP formulations. So vaccines compared to vaccines. That's the equivalent of Advil being compared to a different brand of ibuprofen. It makes no sense. That's not a placebo-controlled study. It's illogical. And no scientist that is telling the truth would say that makes any scientific sense. The MMR vaccine, no saline placebo. It was safety data was collected through observational follow-up studies and compared to historical data, meaning it wasn't even safety tested at all. It was only observationally tested after the fact. There were some studies that used what's called a monovalent vaccine component as comparators, basically meaning they were still studying a vaccine against a vaccine. The polio vaccine safety was compared to other vaccines or previous versions of the polio vaccine, so pretty much the same as DTaP. And then the HIV vaccine was compared against other HIV vaccines. So a lot of the same stuff. So aluminum was used in the Hep B. DTaP was compared against essentially other versions of itself. MMR was compared to other vaccines or just historical data. Polio used other polio vaccines. HIV used other HIV vaccines. That's a big deal because there is literally no other class of drug. And this is really important for people to understand. There is no other class of drug that has ever been approved in the United States of America without a true placebo control group. This is only happening with vaccines. And that is a question that needs to be asked and answered as to why. Now, there is an answer that I have heard as to why that's the case. And that is because in some way it would be unethical to not offer these life-saving vaccines to every single child. There can't be a control group because we can't not give the vaccines, but I would dare say that we can't give the vaccines if we don't know if they're safe. That seems to me even more unethical. My opinion, maybe, but I would anticipate a few people out there agree with me. So that's one of the single biggest things. The next big thing, and this is important too, Holly, I think this is something that people maybe are less aware of than they ought to be, is safety studies. There's a lot that happens after the safety studies are performed with any drug, vaccines or over-the-counter drugs, prescription drugs, whatever, that go on for maybe 6 months, sometimes 12 months, sometimes 3 months, depends on the drug and the class of drug and all these different things. So the length of studies matter, but we know that the FDA eventually recalls, I didn't have this number prepared, but I think it's around 25 to 30%. It might be higher than that, so don't quote me on that one, but I'm pretty sure it's at least that high, if not a little bit higher. Recalls about 25 to 30% of the drugs that they approve after they've been on the market for multiple years because they discover side effects that were not apparent in the 6-month trial or the 1-year trial. So length of time really matters as well. And this is another place where vaccines are not tested as stringently as other drugs. So pre-licensure studies on the hepatitis B vaccine were for 4 to 5 days after each dose.
Really quick, Holly B here. I just wanted to interrupt the podcast to ask you for a quick favor. Can you take just a moment to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you are listening in on? It makes a world of a difference. And the reach of this podcast, it takes like literally under 10 seconds. So go do that right now. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And now back to the episode.
Kids were monitored 4 to 5 days, not weeks, not months, not years, days. And there's an excerpt from the insert in that drug that says, in clinical trials involving 5,071 healthy infants and children, subjects were monitored for 4 days post-vaccination for local reactions and systemic adverse events. So they give it 4 days, and if everything looks okay, then the vaccine couldn't possibly have done harm. And again, that doesn't really jive with every other way or every other drug that's ever been tested. 4 to 8 days for the DTaP vaccine. MMR was studied for 6 weeks, which is substantially longer, but still very short as drug studies go. So again, very typically not studied against placebos and typically studied for a very short period of time. And there are additional, and I'm talking a lot here, Holly, so if you've got anything you want to throw in, feel free. But the other big concerns are that they are typically very small sample sizes. Most pre-licensure trials are powered to detect common adverse events like fever or local swelling, but are not large enough to detect rare but serious events such as seizures, autoimmune issues, neurological disorders. Example, if an adverse event occurs in 1 in 10,000 people, but the trial only includes 1,000 people, then it may very easily go undetected. No long-term outcome tracking. Now, this is one thing that we do see with other drugs in many cases is that the FDA is looking at long-term side effects from drugs that have been released onto the market. So they say, okay, so this drug's approved, but we're going to keep an eye on it for a while and just make sure we didn't screw up approving this drug too early. So then essentially the way FDA works and drug trials and drug approvals work, there is data collected after the drug's approved to just make sure that a year, 2, 3 years down the road that we don't find things that we couldn't find in the 6-month safety studies before. Also, I always get this word mixed up, concomitant vaccine administration in trials. The issue being many trials assess a new vaccine in combination with other vaccines, making it very difficult to isolate which vaccine may have caused an adverse event. So then we don't know. And we know anybody that has children who have been vaccinated know that largely you're not getting a vaccine at one time. You're getting multiple vaccines at one time. That muddies the safety data and reduces clarity about each individual safety profile. There's also the use of comparators. So as discussed earlier, many placebo groups receive another vaccine or aluminum adjuvant, which can mask adverse reactions because both groups are likely to experience the same side effects. So that kind of ends up being more of a washout. If the kids in the quote unquote placebo group with the aluminum or the other vaccine have similar side effects to the kids of the vaccine group, we don't really know if the vaccine is creating unique issues that wouldn't otherwise be caused by a placebo. There's also an exclusion of a high-risk population in these trials. The pre-licensure studies almost always exclude premature babies, immunocompromised individuals, children with autoimmune conditions, children with prior vaccine reactions. These are the very populations that later received vaccines once licensed, but were never tested to see if they were safe in those individuals. So we have this big list of potential issues. Another thing that a lot of the public is not aware of is something called VAERS, which is VAERS, that's the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. This was set up by the government in 1986 or maybe 87 after vaccine manufacturers were given blanket protection against lawsuits from people who claim that their child was potentially injured by a vaccine or that they were injured by a vaccine, an adult vaccine like the flu shot or something like that. Vaccines are the only drugs made in America that the manufacturer of said drug cannot be sued for. Because they can't be sued for it, the government did set up a compensation plan that essentially, if your child gets injured with a vaccine, then you can sue the government, not the drug company. And so drug companies have this significant cash cow that is very protected by the government. And then we have this vaccine adverse event reporting system. Well, that system was studied by Harvard. Harvard generally considered someone who knows how to study data. They studied this and determined that maybe 1% of adverse events from vaccines were actually being reported. 1%. So when we look at actually trying to track whether or not vaccines are actually creating issues, we don't even have a system that actually works to do that. And in fact, once FDA and CDC determined that the VAERS system was so broken that only 1% of these adverse events were being reported, they actually stopped that study and stopped communicating with the people at Harvard that were doing that study. You can take what you want from that. So there's a lot of issues here. And I could go on and on, but the most important thing I think that people need to wrap their heads around is simply that we don't know what we don't know. In fact, during COVID, I did a podcast episode, and that's what the title was. We don't know what we don't know. And that podcast episode was not designed to tell anybody what they should or should not do when it comes to the COVID vaccine. What I intended to do and what I did in that podcast is I said, here is what we know about this vaccine, and here is what we don't know. And as an experimental use vaccine that was never actually put through the same approval process that FDA typically uses for other drugs, and it was rushed to market. Literally what got it here was something called Operation Warp Speed, right? Then there were a lot of unanswered questions about this vaccine. So I believe that we can say that about all vaccines, not just the COVID vaccine. We don't know what we don't know, and we should know those things. So all we need to do, and this sounds so simple, and yet it's not been done, is we need to test vaccinated versus unvaccinated in a significant way and in the correct way. And then we will know what we need to know about the safety and effectiveness and potential, adverse reactions from these medicines.
I think what's hard for a lot of people is that they don't even know what questions to ask. If you're not in the health world at all and we're hit with this crazy pandemic, nobody knows what the heck is going on. And all of the authority figures are saying you have to get this vaccine, you have to protect everybody around you. Even if it maybe sits a little funny in your stomach, you still don't necessarily know what questions to ask the authority figures or what questions or concerns to bring up to the doctors or even just to your friends and family to where your questions sound valid. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And the thing is, whenever you have something, I compare it to a religion. And I'm not opposed to religion, but we do know that generally speaking, when you're raised in a religion, and I don't really care what religion that is, there's certain dogma that you generally just believe because that's what you've been taught. And I don't think that's a very good idea I'm not sure it's a good idea in any aspect of life, but especially in medicine. We shouldn't just take their word for it. that this thing is safe, especially when we recognize that pharmaceutical companies have been fined billions of dollars for outright lying to the government and to the American citizens and world citizens about the things that they've done. We know just, one example, just one very small one is Vioxx, that they covered up and hid their knowledge of it creating heart disease. We know that at least 60,000 people were killed by Vioxx before the government finally caught up to what was going on and, banned the drug. And we know that Vioxx made the drug company far more money than they ever paid in fines while they sold it for that decade or so that they sold it. So for some reason, I think there's a disconnect, Holly. I think to a large degree, most Americans don't trust big corporations. They maybe, think that Ford might be hiding something about the safety of their vehicles, or Toyota, or, Apple might be putting things in their phones to make them fail after 2 years. So people are forced to buy a new iPhone, right? We've heard about that. And maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but there's this general distrust of large corporations who are beholden to their shareholders for high levels of profitability. And yet, for some reason, we think that people that run pharmaceutical companies would not have similar temptations, we'll say, to cover things up, hide things, not disclose things. And yet we know that they've been caught doing that over and over again. So then the question is, why wouldn't they do it with this category of medicine when they've done it with all these other categories of medicine?
Yes. And, I think there's so much distraction. There's so much going on in the world outside of this conversation that we feel like we need to be concerned with. And I think sometimes it's just easier to say, I'm going to choose to just believe the authorities on this one because I don't have the capacity to dive into all that research because I wouldn't even know where to start. So I'm going to believe that they have my best interests at heart. And, I know that when it comes to the vaccine question and whether we should or shouldn't be vaccinating our kids, the one that always comes up in conversation is, yeah, but polio.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to that? Just because I think you basically already did, but can you speak to that just so we can set that record straight?
Yeah. And the thing is, I'll say this about, to preface this, because I definitely want to answer that question. We no longer really have an excuse, I don't think, as parents or as anybody, to not do our own research on a drug that we might be prescribed. And so, let's just say you go into the doctor and you've got high blood pressure and he recommends losartan. There are 1,000 things that you can find on the internet about the safety and efficacy of losartan. And then you can dig into it. You can look at medical-based websites like WebMD that are going to be very pro-pharmaceutical and tend to make things look a little bit better maybe than they actually are. And then you can go the other direction and look at people who are anti-pharmaceutical and you weigh that out. And then you can simply look at the studies if you want to. Now, with AI, you can plug a study into ChatGPT and ask it to tell you what the study actually says if you don't have a real scientific mind or a background in reading studies, and you can break that down. So I don't think there's an excuse anymore to just take anybody's word for it. And I routinely on my podcast, Vitality Radio, say, please don't take my word for it. All I'm trying to do is give you what I believe is true about whatever topic that I'm talking about. I have a very good reason for believing it's true, but I also have my own biases, especially if I'm talking about supplements. I sell supplements for a living, so I'm very pro supplements. And I'm generally speaking going to be more on the side of supplements are good and health promoting and beneficial than the side of supplements are dangerous and understudied and all these other types of things that people would say on the other side of things. But it's not like we have to go read a book anymore and find the book to read to figure out what's true about the thing, right? We have such access now through podcasts and through the internet and everything else that there's really no excuse for that anymore. On the polio thing, that is polio really and measles are the two biggies that most people point to. And I will say this, measles, is, I think, one of the most overblown ones to point to, because when we look at what measles can do for a person if they get measles and recover from measles, like I did as a child, I'm healthier because I had measles. Now, if I were to contract polio and it had the effect on me that polio had on many people, I would not be better off with polio. But with measles, you actually have a much lower risk of cancer later in life. There are all kinds of benefits with the natural immunity that comes with measles that we do not get with the measles vaccine. So you can weigh those two things out and just decide, is measles actually, all you have to do is look at the old Brady Bunch episodes of measles where everybody joked and laughed. Oh, they've all got measles. And we used to have measles parties and chickenpox parties, and kids would get natural immunity and they'd have immunity for their whole lives. And that would actually be good for them. We seem to have forgotten that. And that makes no sense to me. But I get where people would think that polio is super scary, because it is. You get polio and a severe case of polio, and you can be disfigured for life. And of course, in some cases, it can kill you. But when you look at what was happening in the world when the polio vaccine was introduced, and what was happening the few years right before the polio vaccine was introduced, and specifically at the charts of how polio illness was actually diving at a shocking rate prior to the polio vaccine being released, there is a question that I think is a very logical question to ask, and that is, if polio rates were crashing at a dramatic rate prior to the polio vaccine being released, was it the polio vaccine that got rid of polio largely in America, or was polio going away on its own because of sanitation and a variety of other things that were happening at that time in America? And of course, people that are more skeptical of vaccines are typically going to point to those graphs and say, polio was going away, and even measles was dropping at a pretty substantial rate before the measles vaccine was introduced as well. So maybe the vaccine wasn't what did the thing. And then when you look at polio today, it's basically a third world nation problem. It's not found in France and England and America and places like that. And we have been told that's because of the vaccine. But polio is actually on the rise in some countries, specifically in India. And the type of polio that is actually on the rise is what's called vaccine-induced polio. We're actually finding that the type of polio that is most prominent right now comes from the vaccine. It's not wild type polio anymore. So then we know statistically, this is not a conspiracy theory. This isn't anything made up. This is actual science that we have that says that the most common polio in certain parts of the world right now is actually induced by the vaccine. And then the question is the same question that is always asked about drugs, or should always be asked about drugs, and that is the benefit worth the risk? And so the question that needs to be asked in third world nations where sanitation isn't great and nutrition isn't great, and we have a susceptible populace in these places, is the vaccine safer for the person and preventative enough of polio that it is better for them to have it than to risk getting polio, the wild type form of polio? I don't know what the answer is to that question, because I don't think that study's really been done, but there are questions about it. And if we know that the polio vaccine actually causes polio in some cases, which we do, then we should be asking that question as well.
And also, measles is coming up a lot in the conversation these days, too. And every time I hear it come up, it's being blamed. The measles outbreaks are being blamed on the anti-vaxxers who are not vaccinating their kids. Thoughts on that?
So here's the greatest question. I think it's the simplest question, and it's a question that I've asked for years and years. And generally, when I talk to somebody who is not willing to ask questions about vaccines, they dismiss it out of hand, but they don't really have an argument against it. And the question is, if your child is protected by the measles vaccine, then why are you concerned about the child who contracts measles that has not been vaccinated? Because your child is protected, and so they're fine. And yet it seems to me that most of the people that are making that argument are saying, well, everybody needs to have this vaccine because then everybody is protected. If you're genuinely concerned about the other kids that aren't vaccinated and you're not worried about your kids, that's great. That's a very empathetic way to look at things. But what ends up happening is parents end up getting demonized for this. and saying, well, look, measles has essentially been eradicated and now it's not eradicated because a high enough percentage of kids are not getting measles. I'll tell you my take on it, and it's the take I already, briefly started to share, and that is that I think kids are healthier because of measles, not because of the vaccine that prevents measles. Because we do know that the measles vaccine actually does work. We get less measles if we have a higher vaccinated population. That's true. The question is, why do we want less measles? And I think that's a really genuine question, because you know what measles isn't? Measles isn't a disease. It's an illness. It's a short-term illness, like a cold or a flu or a variety of other things that we could potentially get, strep throat, or any of these types of things. It is a one-time occurrence in life. And the vast majority of kids who are even reasonably healthy skate through it and are actually healthier and have a stronger immune system on the other side. So why are we preventing that? Why are we preventing chickenpox is another question I have. Now, again, polio, I get why we want to prevent something like polio. There's a lot of things that are lumped in to vaccines in terms of the types of vaccines that we have. I can understand why when in COVID, we might want an effective and safe vaccine for the elderly and for people who are susceptible, because we know that people had an average of almost 4 comorbidities that actually died in this country from COVID. So maybe we want a vaccine for those people. But why are we vaccinating children with a COVID vaccine when children don't die from COVID, unless unbelievably rare cases that happens? It's far less than 0.0001% of children that were ever harmed by COVID in this country. Why vaccinate them against it when now they're going to have boosters year after year just to try and maintain immunity from it, when we know that there is at least some risk of harm from the vaccine and virtually no risk of harm from COVID itself for those children? We have to start having a nuanced conversation about this. And I don't think polio is measles, and I don't think COVID is the flu. And I don't, we need to look at all of these as individual things and determine not just, does the vaccine make sense for this particular population? Because that's probably the very first question. And then, is it safe? How long is it effective? And would the person actually be better off just contracting the illness? Because I've had COVID once. I got COVID in 2022, late 2021, I guess it was. I got it. I'm over it. I've never had it again. I've met many people who've had the COVID vaccine who have had COVID 5, 6, 7 times. I'm not totally convinced that I'm not better off. In fact, I'll say I'm totally convinced that I'm better off having not had the intervention, getting the actual illness, and creating immunity to it.
We've covered a lot, and you warned me that we probably wouldn't get to all the topics that I was hoping to get to today, and you're definitely right. But I'm so glad that we really dove into this. I think it's, like you said, this is not a black and white subject, and people are making it black and white, making it good versus bad, but it's so nuanced. It's so nuanced. And for me, I think that it's just about informed choice. And that's why we have to have these conversations, and we have to not demonize people for asking the questions. If you ask the questions, you may end up deciding, yes, I do want to go ahead with this vaccine schedule or with that schedule for my kid, but I want to know. And you've laid out for us, I think, pretty clearly that we really don't have the data historically that everybody has been told we do. We've essentially been lied to. Or I should say, we've been misinformed or not given the whole truth around the safety of these vaccines and the potential harm that could come out of it should you decide to go ahead with the vaccine schedule. Hey, I just wanted to jump in here and interrupt the program for just a hot minute. You know that I'm so passionate about this podcast, but what I'm also really passionate about is helping women with lupus minimize their symptoms, boost their energy so that they can indulge in life again. So if you are a woman who is struggling with lupus, who is sick and tired of being sick and tired, who's struggling to manage your flares, If you're finding that your lupus symptoms are just really getting in the way of you being able to live your life the way you want to, I feel you. I've been there myself and I felt the same way. And what I've found is that there are a certain set of health fundamentals that, once applied, will support you in your foundational health. They will support you in building and maintaining that energy, minimizing flares, and allowing you to again indulge in life and follow your passions. So, if that is something that you are interested in creating for yourself, let's jump on a call together. I will walk you through the process that I use with my clients to get them from sick and tired to strong foundation of health by implementing my Health Bridge protocol. If this is something you're interested in chatting more about, I would love to talk to you. Apply for a free clarity call with me, and I look forward to getting to know you soon. And now back to the episode.
Exactly. And that's exactly right. And I know a lot of parents who are on all sides of this issue. And there's not two sides of this issue. There's actually a few sides. There's the I don't vaccinate my children, period side. There's the I vaccinate people exactly when the schedule says that I should vaccinate them. And there's a bunch of people that are like, well, I don't do more than one vaccine at a time. I spread them out further and I pick and choose which vaccine I give. And in that group, there's a wide range, right? Some that maybe vaccinate just a few times, some that vaccinate more, but spread it out more, that kind of thing. And frankly, I honor anyone who does the research and comes to whatever conclusion they come to because they at least did the research. Now, we have to be careful with the research because it's the exact same thing that I said, because everybody has a bias. Clearly, pharma and government are very pro-vaccine. And if you're looking at the CDC website or the FDA website or the AMA or Cleveland Clinic, or you name the medical website, they're going to have a very specific slant toward the vaccines. If you look at Children's Health Defense or the High Wire or a variety of places out there, they're going to have a very specific stance as well. It behooves you, I think, to do as best you can to look at both sides and try and figure it out for yourself. But one place that I found is extremely useful, and my son actually found this for me, which is interesting because I didn't know it existed. And now that I know it exists, I've been sharing it with a lot of people. It's called vaccine.guide. So .guide instead of .com. And have you heard of this one?
No.
Yeah, most people don't know about it. I don't think I've never met anybody that knew about it when I shared it with them. But what's really neat about it is that everything on vaccine.guide is actually medical. It's the package inserts from vaccines. It's studies that have actually been done on vaccines. It is all stuff that actually comes from either the manufacturers or government studies that have been done on vaccines. And so it doesn't have a bias. It's just data. Now, I would anticipate that the people that put this website together do have a bias, but they have not written an article saying this is how we feel. They're just saying, here's a bunch of data, you read it, you decide. I think it's an incredible resource because, interestingly enough, it all comes from the side of people who are very pro-vaccine and vaccine schedule. And yet, as you dig through it, you start to recognize maybe there's a lot more to this than we've been told or, led to believe. So I highly recommend that. There's a couple of other things that I recommend. There's a guy named Dr. Paul Thomas, and I've actually interviewed him on my show a couple of times. He's an interesting doctor because he wrote a book called The Vaccine Friendly Plan. He's a pediatrician, and he tells his whole story on my show, and he's been on a bunch of other shows as well. But he's a pediatrician who basically determined that he was seeing a lot more ear infections and allergies and sinus infections and these types of things in his in his vaccinated group of kids versus his unvaccinated group of kids. And the way he ended up with an unvaccinated group of kids in his pediatrician's office is that he wrote this book when he determined that he thought the vaccine schedule was just too aggressive. He was very pro-vaccine. He thought we were giving too many vaccines at one time and too early in life in certain cases. So he wrote a book saying, I'm pro-vaccine, but I think we're doing it too aggressively. Let's dial it back a little bit and give these kids a little bit more time to adapt and for their immune systems to develop before, we do these things. And he made some very specific recommendations based on that. When that book came out, a lot of parents that had vaccine questions started sending their kids to his office because he at least understood that they had questions, where a lot of pediatricians would just say, I'm not interested in hearing what you have to say about vaccines. And many pediatricians will simply not even serve you if you aren't interested in following the vaccine schedule. So first he wrote that book. Years over the next several years, he started to recognize that he had all these kids that were not vaccinated or were mildly vaccinated versus the other kids in his clinic. And he started recognizing patterns where he was seeing less of these common childhood ailments in the unvaccinated group, but he wasn't sure if that was actually what he was seeing or if it just seemed that way. So in his words, he hired the most nerdy math guy that he could find, and a guy who had no bias whatsoever. And he just said, take all my 10,000 patients, took all the names out to protect HIPAA and all these things, and said, take all this data from 10,000 patients and tell me what the numbers actually look like, vaccinated versus unvaccinated. And that's what he did. And I don't remember how many months or years it took him to compile all the data. But what he found is there was literally not a single ailment that he saw children for in his office that wasn't happening at significantly higher rates in the vaccinated community than the unvaccinated community. Now, at this point, Paul Thomas is no longer practicing medicine as a pediatrician because he released that study and they took away his license. You can, again, make of that what you will, but that's an interesting thing. That's 10,000 kids. Nobody else was doing this study. So he figured, I've got the data, I'll at least do it on my group of kids and we'll see what happens. There's also a book, I've got it right here, called Vax-Unvaxxed, and it's actually written by Robert Kennedy Jr. and Brian Hooker. And what they did is they took all the studies that they could find, because there have been some, they're just very limited, of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, and just lay it all out. It's all very well documented. And it's, again, not opinion, it's data. And you can look and see, okay, what does unvaxxed look like versus vaxxed? And you get to decide. The biggest thing that I think I can leave your audience with when it comes to vaccines anyway, is as a parent, our greatest job is to take care of the welfare of our children, right? Whether it's physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, all the things that parents are tasked with. I have 4 kids myself and a couple of stepchildren, and now I've got 6 grandkids. So I got a bunch of them in my life. And I believe that is a great duty. I think most parents feel that way as well. It is very easy as a parent to be overwhelmed. There is so much to try and figure out. And now in the world of the internet and social media, you have so many different things coming at you. You're worried about aluminum in your cookware and in your deodorant and artificial dyes in your kids' food or even in their medicines, and all these different things that we have to be concerned about. And it is a lot. It is a lot. But when we're talking about medical interventions, whether it's children's Tylenol or a vaccine, I believe that it behooves every one of us to do at least that basic research, look at both sides of the story. And if you're someone who practices a faith, take it to God, pray, meditate, do what it takes for you to come to a comfort level with what you're doing for your children, regardless of what that answer is for you. At least then you have the peace of mind of, I have looked into this, I have made an informed decision, and at that point you can proceed. Until you've done that, you're simply taking somebody's word for it. And I just don't believe that's a great way to do it.
Yeah, let's stop making it a bad thing to do your own research. We were just told that if you were doing your own research, that you didn't know what you were doing, and that we should immediately disregard anything you say because you did your own research instead of listening to the quote unquote authorities. But I have always been a fan of doing my own research as somebody with an autoimmune condition who, didn't even have that diagnosis for the majority of my health journey. But I knew something was wrong. I had to do my own research because my blood work looked good. So the doctors didn't have anything to do for me. They didn't have any way of helping me. So let's take away that stigma and empower ourselves by listening to podcasts like this, by looking up and listening to Dr. Paul Thomas, who I have heard speak, by the way, on a couple podcasts, and he's brilliant. And his story is quite incredible of how
And,
his practice
and he's a
shifted
guy who had nothing to gain by doing what he did. In fact, he had everything to lose. He
and
had
did.
everything to lose, and he did lose the, his passion, his career was taking care of children, and he's not able to do that anymore.
Right.
So it's not like he did it because he was going to get famous. He was going to make millions of dollars on a book deal or any of these kind of things. He has paid a very heavy price for simply sharing data and saying, I think we need to look closer at this thing. And it's a shame. But that's the other thing that we have to look at. And I think if we're willing to just step back a little bit and take away our own bias and just look at it with as open a mind as we're capable of and say, why would it be that someone like Paul Thomas, that someone like RFK Jr. or any of these other people would come out with this strong stance on this thing that is so controversial and so demonizing if you come out on the wrong side of it? Why would they risk all of that if there's no power in it, there's no wealth in it? RFK barely got in on the confirmation hearings because of things he said about vaccines over the years, right? He could have, half of his family's disowned him because of what he said about vaccines over the years. They think he's crazy. And maybe he is, maybe he's not, but I'm telling you, he didn't have anything to gain by it. That's not how he made his money. He had money going into it. He didn't need to get rich writing books about vaccines, and frankly, hasn't gotten rich writing books about vaccines. Most of his work has been nonprofit. So again, whether you like him, don't like him, whatever it is, there isn't a lot of value in swimming against the stream in this area. You can get deplatformed, you can lose your license, you can lose your livelihood, all these different things that happen to people who take a stance. And the same thing happens on other controversial issues, right? I mean, you can take all the different things that we fight about in this country, whether it's the war in Ukraine or what's happening in Gaza or what's happening with abortion or what's happening with 100 other super divisive things. And I think when you look at that and you look at how you can be demonized if you're on the wrong side of that thing versus how media portrays it and how government portrays it, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that people would take all that risk if they didn't really have a true passion for the truth. I could be wrong, but that's how I see it.
I couldn't agree with you more. Jared, I know that you have to go. So where can people find you?
Well, hopefully you can find me on your show again. We'll finish this episode.
Definitely.
We'll talk about the other things. Do you mind if I tease the other things we were going to talk about real
Please,
quick?
please.
Yeah, so we've got some really cool things that I think will be very interesting to your listeners. We want to talk about proton pump inhibitors, PPIs, things like Nexium and Prilosec and Prevacid and those kind of things. Are they safe for long-term use? The FDA actually has never approved them for more than 12 weeks, and yet people have been on them for 10, 15, 20 years. And we have data that indicates that's a real problem. So we're going to talk about that. And I've got personal experience with reflux, as apparently so do you. So really excited to hear it talk about that. We'll talk about antibiotics and are they as safe as we've been led to believe? Are there true alternatives that actually work? And are they being used in places where they don't even make sense? We'll also talk about autoimmune disease and how it can be managed in many cases without drugs, when in most cases, people who are diagnosed with autoimmune disease are told that all that can be done is managing their symptoms. And then we can, if you'd like, we talked a little bit about it, but FDA approvals and how drugs are actually approved in this country and who's paying for that. I think those are all pretty meaty topics that we can dig into. But as far as finding me, if I didn't scare you away, I have Vitality Radio podcast. I'm on about 530 episodes right now of that show. I do 2 of them a week. My background is I grew up in a health food store. I had parents that were weird before it was cool. We were into organic back before people were ever talking about organic, that kind of thing. And I've made it my life's work and passion, and it really is, to help educate people on natural supplements, how to use them appropriately, how to know if you're getting a good one or not, and when it makes sense to take them, how to take them, and all that kind of thing. And then we also do something fun on our website or on our podcast that is not something that I can sell you, but I think is probably the best information I deliver. And that is what we call our emotional vitality series, where we help people with the mindset of health and mental health and how to get out of your own way if you feel stuck in your illness, whether it's physical or mental. we can help you to get past that with tools that we share for free on Vitality Radio. And then we have vitalitynutrition.com, which is our website where we have great chat feature. If you have questions about supplements, we can answer those there. And we have our brick and mortar store in Utah, in Bountiful, Utah. And we're happy to take phone calls asking about these things as well at 801-292-6662.
Amazing. I will have to visit you guys if I happen to get back to Utah anytime soon. I would love to see your store. I worked for many years in an integrative pharmacy out here as well. So I have that love for it for sure.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate having me on. This is a super divisive topic. I've had many experts on my show talking about this over the years, and it's a tough one for people to hear sometimes. It's a very uncomfortable subject for people who stuck through this entire time that maybe were pricked with a little discomfort at first. Thank you. Thanks for sticking around and listening to this, because it is a nuanced conversation, I think, that does need to be had. It doesn't have to change your opinion about anything or how you proceed with these things, but it is at least a piece of the pie of the knowledge that I think you need to have in order to make the best decisions for you and your family. So thanks for hanging with us.
Jared, thanks so much. I can't wait for part 2 of this conversation.
Very excited to do it with you. Thank you so much, Holly.
I have been so itching to have that conversation, and I'm so glad that I was introduced to Jared and that this is a topic that he is very knowledgeable about and can speak very well to. I know this is something that for me has been a hard subject to have discussions around with people whom I love, who are also pro-vaccine. And because I feel innately that there are so many things to be questioned here, that doesn't mean that I'm innately against vaccines, but just that I have questions, right? And I have a hard time remembering all the facts in order to regurgitate the things that we talked about in this episode to the people that I would love to have this conversation with. So that was my motivation in having this conversation, is that I want you to have a resource that you can share with others who are at least open to having the conversation, or at least open to being willing to ask the questions, as Jared said in the episode. If you are somebody who, like me, has a hard time holding on to the information in your head about all the different details of the different vaccines, I think this is a great resource for you, like I said, to share with friends, family, or anybody else you come across that is interested in the subject, but maybe not willing to just jump into a conversation with someone because they might feel defensive, or the other person might feel defensive, and it could, easily blow up into an argument. I find that having a good resource like this episode is excellent to have in your back pocket to say, I have a hard time really clarifying exactly why I feel this way. Can I share this episode with you? And you'll get a better idea of why I want to do my own research on this topic, and just leave it at that. And you can share this episode. In fact, I highly encourage you to share this episode because, again, this is a conversation that just needs to be had. We need to be able and willing to talk about the hard things. And this is one of the hardest things I think that's come up in the last many years and has really been pushed into the spotlight through the pandemic. So thank you for, again, sharing this episode with somebody that is open to it. And please, as Jared said, reach out to his company to ask more questions, or subscribe to his podcast, because he's got an amazing array of guests with so much quality information for your health journey. And then if you are ready to start working on your own health, I assume you're on a health journey, which is why you are interested in my podcast and why you listen in. I would love to chat with you, see where you're at, what you're struggling with, how your health situation is affecting your life. And let's set you up with some tools that you can start using right away to make some easy shifts that could make a really huge difference for you. The link to apply for a call with me is in the show notes. I look forward to chatting with you and meeting you. And I thank you for listening in, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Health Bridge podcast.